Thank you all so much for coming. I'm glad the weather deities have been nice to us and held the rain back and delayed the start of the last game of the World Series till 7:30, so everything is fine. Okay. Today I will hopefully finish when events began. But one thing which I wanted to emphasize about sort of this is a world historical event. This has affected world history. What I've been trying to show last week and continue this week and thereon is that not only was that a world historical event, it was already a part of world history. The world history converged on that event and a variety of different historical trajectories. So let me give you just a brief recap, not of why I would call attention to certain dates last week. So for instance, when I began here at the 5th century BCE, in other words, before the beginning of Christianity, what I wanted to call attention to is that notion of seeing this as, and everybody always, and everybody hates the Jews. You didn't need Christianity for there to be Jew hatred. It pre-existed Christianity. It was there. And so to see this as just a culmination, which is, so one could look at it in that way. I'm not saying, and again, that's not what I'm saying is the case. I'm saying that when you look at a date like this is what you're saying about the attempted destruction of European Jewry, that it's really, the world has always hated the Jews. Okay? I'm not saying that is, please, I don't mean to be redundant and repeating myself, but that's not what I'm saying. But if you choose this as a date, that's where you're going to. Okay? If you go to like the first centuries of the Common Era, then you're looking at the Jews in relationship to Christianity and seeing the Jews as Christianity's other. That as Christianity emerged, the Jews were always already its other and different relationships. But I also talked about how there was this sort of knot, this tie, double bind between Judaism and Christianity, the soteriological bind, that is the necessity to preserve a remnant of Jews, albeit in a miserable condition, but to preserve that remnant, both to bear witness to the truth of Christianity and when the last Jew converts for the second coming to arrive. So that's another way in which we can talk about the first century and notions of replacement. Okay. When I would go all the way to the 4th century of the Common Era, what I wanted to call attention to is here, states are restricting Jewish life. Okay? We're talking about a political government act in terms of affecting Jewish life. It may have been a Christian state, but it is a state that's engaged in doing this. I wanted to emphasize that relationship between a state and people who are marginalized, othered, minority. Okay? Or when I went here to 1096, which is to talk about opening up the possibility of massacres of Jewish communities. Or to this date, with the blood libel and the notion of ritual killing, the belief that Jews are the enemies of humanity, that what they desire to do is kill humanity, because this opened up the possibility not only of just recreating the killing of Jesus, but also this kind of bloodthirstiness, this need for the blood of others, as a way of understanding how one could understand this attempted destruction. And again, with this state was dealing with, how all of a sudden difference is something that should be eliminated. This was the Albigensian Crusade. So all these different possibilities are coming forth. With 1492, the notion of ethnic cleansing, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, as earlier Jews had been expelled from England and from France. So the notion of removal, not death, but removal, that there would be no Jews in this particular space. As well, as I also mentioned, in terms of ritual purity, notions of descent, and a problem opening up. How does one tell the difference between a Gentile and a Jew? That this becomes a problem for how Gentiles, I'm using this broadly, not just Spain or later, as I talked about in terms of nationalism and in terms of emancipation with 1789, with the notions of allowing Jews to be integrated into society, where they'd be dressing similarly, have similar values, share a common culture. But what is integration from one perspective is infiltration from another. Just to emphasize the point. Or with the 1810s, what I was drawing on there, this emergence of nationalism, of a notion of land and people, of blood and soil, as a motivation for maintaining the exclusion of groups of people. And if they refuse to be excluded, to be engaged with violently. And also a notion of chosenness. Nationalism, American nationalism is American chosenness. German nationalism was the Germans were the chosen people, and there can only be one chosen people. Okay. And with the 1850s, I brought forth and was talking about the emergence of a notion of race as a key way of understanding how history develops and how that intersected with the emergence of Darwinism and social Darwinism, and seeing rather than the struggle between species being read as the struggle between races. And therefore providing a scientific grounding for why Jews should be removed, or other people and other groups to be removed, other races. I did not, anyway, so at this point we had the recap. Any questions, specific questions? And I'll move on then. I put up 1858. And that date is specific to, this is the kidnapping of Edgardo Mortaro, who was a boy in the Papal States whose nanny claimed that she baptized him, and any Jewish child who was baptized in the Papal States had to be removed from the Jewish family. But why this is so important is that part of the response to this within the Jewish community was the development of a group called the Alliance Israélite Universelle, the Universal Israelite Alliance, which created a sense of an international Jewish community, an international Jewish organization. Again, not just a matter of Jews infiltrating a nation, Jews infiltrating and trying to seek power everywhere. (1871). Hey, Saul. Sorry. Okay. 1871. Before 1871, we couldn't talk about Germany. There was no Germany. There was Prussia, there was Bavaria. 1871, you have the creation of the Second Reich, the German Reich. It also marked the emancipation of the Jews in Germany throughout. However, and this becomes important, Germany was the empire was a federal system. In other words, individual states or kingdoms within the empire could have their own rules. And this is important because if you were a Bavarian Jew, you could become a university professor, you could become an officer in the military. If you were Prussian, you could not. And the importance of this exclusion of Jews from being able to become officers is very important because the military and the reserve force was a major source of social networking and integration in Prussia. So Jews were being excluded and setting up, even as they were being emancipated, they were creating conditions for exclusion of Jews, of othering as Jews. They may look like us, but they are nevertheless different. 1873. In 1873, world stock markets crashed, began a depression that would last until 1896 worldwide. One response, insofar as the depression was tied into the collapse of the stock markets, the old notion that Jews were just concerned about money, that now part of their emancipation allowed them to become stockbrokers, financiers, that the Jews were responsible for the economic crisis, not just affecting Germany or Austria or France, but everywhere. And so this whole notion of Jews as controlling the finances and taking over and having to, that kind of power, and their source of the misery, especially the misery of those who were most affected by the Depression, which weren't necessarily the rich, but those who were caught up in the transformations in Europe, people who were being proletarianized, becoming workers at, ridiculous, 15 cents there was no minimum wage. Okay. 1879. 1879 was the year that, as I mentioned last week, the word anti-Semitism was invented, coined. And again, as I said before, anti-Semitism pre-existed the word, but the word itself emerged to say, no, this isn't about something religious. It isn't about the hatred of the Jews. It's not about deicides. This is scientific. We're talking about a natural difference between Jews and other people. And also in 1879, you had the emergence in Germany, of what was known as political anti-Semitism. You now began to have parties formed where anti-Semitism was proposed legislation against Jews' integration into society were part of political platforms in Germany, Austria, other countries. Important thing to recognize, though, is that, especially in Germany, within 10 years, political anti-Semitic movement became all but non-existent except in selected states, states which unfortunately now you see as supporters of the Alternative für Deutschland, like Saxony. They sort of stay there. But that's 1879. The 1880s. I want to emphasize two key aspects here. In the 1880s, Darwin's cousin, Galton, developed a new science called eugenics, a way by which one can cultivate populations of humans the way one would cultivate herds, animals. And you would have positive eugenics, in other words, ways in which we try to further the right kind of people to be produced and to further and live good lives. But then you also had negative eugenics, culling out, removing the bad people. And so a notion of eugenics in Germany, it was called racial hygiene, became the scientific. Now, we might look at this and say it's pseudoscience. Okay, there's no basis in genetics for their claims. Objectively, factually, yes, that's true. But how it functioned and how people viewed it in people's lives, in that society, it was science. So if something is false, but it's treated as if it's true, it has power and authority. Also, during this time is the emergence of parasitology. Why is this important? There were invasions of pests, bugs from North America that was affecting the crops in Europe. Foreign pests that had to be eliminated. And the language that one used in terms of evolution, like survival of the fittest and notions of removing and exterminating these dangerous pests, these kinds of language began to be applied. And the language of parasitology was adopting the language of talking about humans and social Darwinism. And the language discussing humans began adopting the language of parasitology. That is, Jews are foreign pests. And what do you do with foreign pests? What do you do with pests? You get rid of them, you exterminate them. So you now have this cross-fertilization of language, which makes it so much easier to undertake the kinds of things that would happen in the attempted destruction of European Jewry. Now, some of you have wondered, why so specific for 1889, April 20th? Any guesses? Exactly, Adolf Hitler's birth. So if it's all Hitler, his idea, his intention, his realization, here's when it began. Okay, 1894 to 1900. The Dreyfus Affair. Dreyfus was the only Jewish member of the French military staff, general staff. There had been acts of espionage. Is there a problem? Does it work? Thank you. Okay, sorry about that. Someone was stealing secrets, giving them to the Germans, and they blamed Dreyfus. Forged documents to prove his guilt, publicly humiliated him, sent him to Devil's Island. Several years later, there was a member of the military judicial corps in France who recognized there were problems with the evidence. There was a call now for a new trial. In 1898, a new trial took place. Dreyfus was found guilty again. And that's where, after which Zola would come out, j'accuse, I accuse, in response to the second trial. But throughout France, there was a massive division of society into the Dreyfusards and the anti-Dreyfusards, those who were against Dreyfus, because they viewed supporting Dreyfus means you're supporting, or you're saying that those individuals, the military, the government, the church, are all lying, that they are all have been acting immorally, ethically. In other words, to support Dreyfus is to be against the church, to be against the military, to be against the state. And you had a massive anti-Jewish campaign throughout France. Now, eventually by 1900, Dreyfus was allowed to return to France, and ultimately by 1906 he was pardoned and cleared. But if you asked anybody in 1900, if you said to them, 40 years from now, a major European state will undertake the attempted destruction of European Jewry, what country do you think people would have, what country would you think? France, not Germany. Number two, either Russia or Austria-Hungary, because the anti-Semitic movement and anti-Semitism was still very strong. You had an anti-Semitic mayor of Vienna, the capital of Austria, okay? But Germany was much further down the line, okay, politically. 1905 to 1907. Germany was very late getting into the great game of getting colonies. To the 1880s, they were given colonies in East Africa and in Southwest Africa. These places happened already to be occupied by indigenous peoples like the Herero. During this period, the German colonial forces engaged in a genocidal effort to destroy the Herero. Shooting them, killing them, but most important, pushing them into the desert and lining up barbed wire and machine guns to prevent anyone from returning from the desert. Now, eventually, the German government called a stop to this, but for some, this was the first genocide of the 20th century, was what was engaged here. And also, in part of the response to this was the first miscegenation laws enacted in Germany. In other words, they forbade marriages between Germans and Africans and would not recognize the children of any such coupling as citizens. So these emerged there, and also a notion of colonialism, of taking over land, pushing out those who are currently there and making it their own, and exploiting what population that lives there. So that's happening during this period. Questions? Yes?
So the Herero people were Africans?
They were Africans, the Herero. And so roughly 60 to 70,000, I mean, again, there were at least that were murdered. (1914 to 1980). Oh, I forgot one thing about this period, 1894 to 1900. The Zionist movement, the first International Zionist Congress. This will become very important in a few moments. But the notion associating of the Jews, the international organization, and the word Zion. But in just a few, 1914 to 1918, the Great War. At the beginning of the war in Germany, the emperor called for a great civil peace. In other words, all Germans, Jews, Protestants, Catholics, they were all Germans. So for the first time, Jews were allowed to become officers in the Prussian military because Prussia provided a military, Bavaria did, they all did. Just as, if you recall, in the Civil War, you had the 1st Massachusetts, the 2nd Ohio, just as this was how it worked in Germany. So everybody was behind the war. Everybody was a German. But in 1916, there was what was known as the Jewish Census. The war was in a stalemate. The military wasn't exactly fond of the Jews, and of course they were already looking for scapegoats. And they figured the Jews were stereotypically cowards. They'd be staying at the home front trying to exploit the war. So they took a census of soldiers on the front line to see whether or not there were Jews there proportionate to the number of Jews in Germany. What they found out was that they were. They never released the information. Everybody assumed that the census would demonstrate that the Jews were just as they are stereotypically understood to be. And so after the war, that notion, what was created by the Jewish census, helped contribute to the thought of Jews as those who stabbed Germany in the back, as responsible. Because when the war ended in 1918, on November 11th at 11:11 a.m., there was not a single foreign soldier on any German territory. The emperor had abdicated 3 days before, so it was the government who was there, the Social Democratic government, who was the one who signed the surrender agreement. So they became the November traitors. They were responsible, as well as those who did not fight for Germany. They were the ones who were responsible for this, because the home front had no idea that Germany was in a position where they had to surrender. There was no troops in German territory. And all the press, with press censorship, always would talk about, okay, the next moment we're going to, get the advantage. And all of a sudden they learn they've lost. So at the end of the war, there is the sense of and already planned by the military, who was going to be blamed for the stab in the back. And it was going to be the Jews, it was going to be the pacifists, it was going to be the war profiteers, it was going to be the Social Democrats, it was going to be the communists, everybody but the military. And also for those who went through the Great War, 4 years of stalemate, 4 years of fighting, which primarily left friends who were dead or permanently damaged from gas, from all of this. This kind of notion of progress, of possibility, shattered for those who were fighting. So that began to shape an atmosphere, a mood in Germany. But this kind of feeling about the Great War was throughout. It wasn't just Germany. The French, all those soldiers who were there had a comparable experience. Okay, the lost generation. I put 1915 plus because in 1915, beginning in April of 1915, in Istanbul, was the beginning of the Armenian Genocide. Somewhere over 1.5 million Armenians were killed, either executed, dying on these marches through desert, thrown into the deserts of Iraq and Western Syria. And it's this Armenian genocide, as I talked about on the first night, the first evening, which was in the mind of creating the notion of genocide. Okay. Why am I slipping on his mind? Len, help me. Lemkin. Yeah, thank you, Rob. Lemkin. It was his awareness of this that was so key. Another aspect, just for a little bit. Franz Werfel wrote a novel about this, The 40 Days of Mossadegh. Any of you heard it? I mean, there was supposed to be actually a movie made about it. It was a worldwide bestseller. And these were about a group of Armenians who resisted the Turks in this mountain fortress. And I bring it up because this novel inspired the fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto. So in this sense, this attempts to trying to deal with how Armenians responded, and the novel was based on actual events, was something that also provided motivation for the Jews who were in the ghettos about to be liquidated. Okay? 1919, 1920. Okay. Books being passed around because it was during this period that a book, a forgery that had been produced for the Russian secret police to provide a legitimation for the pogroms that were being committed against the Jews in the Russian Pale settlement, arrived with the White Russians fleeing the Russian Revolution into Munich and began a series of translations into German, into French, into English of the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. This forgery proclaimed that the Jews had a secret plot for world conquest. And it was everywhere. It appeared in English in the Dearborn Independent and then was published as the International Jew by a certain Henry Ford. And even though by 1922 in the London Times, which initially had spoken favorably or positively or accepted the protocols, was demonstrated line by line the sources of the forgery, as many of you may know, still today, individuals believe that the protocols of the elders of Zion is true and is actually being acted upon by the Jews. So that was what was emerging there, and also surrounding that period in 1919 and 1920 in Munich, a little tiny party. There were lots of parties forming, conservative parties, all throughout Germany. And one of them, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, began, and by 1920, adopted this name, had a platform, and had a charismatic leader who had been born in April of 1889. So out of this period of just conflict and emergence of very conservative groups comes this one party that for the next 10 years remained a very tiny party. In 1920, a work of medical ethics appeared by a major jurist and a psychiatrist, which was discussing the authorization for the elimination of lives unworthy of living, euthanasia. Drawing upon the experience that had happened in Germany when there was mass famine in Germany during the winter of 1917, 1918 during the war. Resources were limited, distribution was controlled, and food did not make its way into the mental asylums and some 60,000 inhabitants of the mental asylums. These lives unworthy of living starved to death. This text by these very learned and honored individuals became a standard text in German medical ethics. And that was in 1920. Questions? In 1921, the stormtroopers were created. This was the paramilitary organ of the National Socialist Party, of the Nazis. And for the next 12 years of the Weimar Republic, they were the most prominent face because they were in the streets fighting the paramilitary organizations of the communists. And when they weren't beating up other paramilitary organizations, they were beating up, among other groups, Jews. So these are the brown shirts. And they emerged in 1921. In 1923, Germany was gripped by an impossible to imagine inflation. Between February and November, 30 cents worth of German currency changed from 1 mark to hundreds of billions of marks. People would demand not only be paid in the afternoon, to be paid in the morning. So during lunch, they'd go and shop because they knew by the afternoon their salary could not afford groceries. It shattered the middle class. It created a sense of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we will die. A fatalism emerged. A sense of helplessness over forces for which you have no control. How can you understand how your currency can like quadruple overnight? So this fear of these mysterious forces that are causing harm to us eventually was regulated. But also in 1923, in Munich, the beer hall putsch took place. The National Socialists on November 8th attempted to take over the Bavarian government. They were assuming that there was going to be another move in Berlin to take over the Prussian government, and together they would lead to this new control of Germany. It collapsed, failed. About 20 to 30 National Socialist revolutionaries were killed. Adolf Hitler was arrested, was going to be put on trial for treason, was found guilty, given a 5-year sentence. He went into prison at the beginning of 1924, and by the end of 1924, he was out. But he came out with, I don't know, a gift for everyone. It is there that he wrote the first volume of Mein Kampf. So Mein Kampf emerged in 1924 while he was in prison. So one could think of it, okay, here was the blueprint, and we can argue this, but we don't have time to argue it now. We can argue it later. But here's Mein Kampf, and also the awareness of how a sort of indulgence of those who were on the conservative side to be sort of allowed away. 1929 to 1930. Now at this point, in 1929, in national elections, the Nazi Party was drawing 2% of the vote, all but non-existent. 1929 to 1930, the World Depression. Millions are unemployed. And there's an election in 1930. The National Socialists run a campaign. And although anti-Semitism had been a major part of their 1920 platform, that was not what they highlighted. What they highlighted was they were the people who was going to restore what's called a Volksgemeinschaft, a community of the people, the folk from nationalism. In other words, It'll be like Lake Wobegon. Everybody, all of the kids will be above average. Everybody will know your name. That's the Volksgemeinschaft. And this is what they ran on. We Germans are going to restore the German people as a community instead of this divisiveness, this being at the grips of capitalism, which is leading all of this destruction to people's lives. And they got 18% of the vote. And they became a serious political presence in Germany. In 1932, there was going to be a presidential election. Hindenburg, who had been viewed as the great hero for the German Great War, was running. And the way it worked, as if you followed the recent presidential election in France, the two top vote getters have a runoff. To everybody's surprise, Adolf Hitler came in second. Now he was a national presence and an innovative presence. He was the first person to run a political campaign via airplane. They would fly him from stop to stop to stop. So whereas trains go quite fast, but planes and so Hitler was everywhere. Hindenburg won, but he won by only 1 million votes. In July, there was another election. The National Socialists won 38% of the vote, and they were the largest party in the Reichstag. They were not in the government. There have been a series of other conservative parties interacting. They were not in the government. Because, again, coalitions need to be formed. But since no government could be formed, there had to be another parliamentary election. So in November of 1932, there was another election. The National Socialists lost 6% of the popular vote. They were down to 32%. It looked as if the National Socialists had reached their peak. We're now losing support. Still, no government could be formed. By late January, these brilliant, conservative politicians felt, okay, what we need to do, in part, to neutralize not only Adolf Hitler, but also to neutralize the violence that was taking place in the streets between the National Socialists, between the stormtroopers and the communists and the social democratic paramilitary organizations. We will recommend to the president that he be named chancellor. He wasn't elected chancellor. He was going to be named chancellor by Hindenburg. Hindenburg resisted. But then they were able to convince Hindenburg, who at this point was late onset Alzheimer's, convinced him that if we put them in the government, they would have to calm down because they would want to maintain their support, and therefore they wouldn't do outrageous things. They wouldn't do things that were out of the ordinary. They wouldn't try to shake the boat. They wouldn't try to drain the swamp. They would just be under control. And only 3 members of the National Socialists would be in this cabinet. And so on January 30th, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, was named Chancellor of Germany. And there was going to be another election in March, March 5th. Well, the stormtroopers did not get off the streets during February, and if anything, the violence continued, became greater. And it was very clear that the National Socialists were going to lose even more popularity. But thankfully, there was a Dutch communist who was let out of prison in the morning, and that evening, the Reichstag, the parliament building, went up in flames. As a consequence of this, and him being caught, the chancellor was given executive powers to rule by emergency laws, ruled by decree. And he began an attempt to round up all of these individuals behind the destruction of the Reichstag, and the stormtroopers and the police began rounding up all of the communists, who were the second largest party in Germany. On March 5th was the election. Most of the members of the Reichstag who were members of the Communist Party were either in hiding or in prison or dead. Even so, the National Socialists did not get a majority. They got between 42 and 44% of the vote. In this last free multi-party election, they still did not have a majority. They were the largest party, but no majority. On March 20th, a solution to where do you put all these communists, traitors, where do you put them all? Well, there's a lovely suburb outside of Munich called Dachau. And in Dachau, on March 20th, they opened up a concentration camp, the first concentration camp, a concentration that had been modeled after the camps, the protective camps that the Turks had presented for the Armenians, that the German colonial folks had provided for the Herero, that the English had provided for the Boers. So Dachau was opened as a concentration camp, in other words, something other than a prison, primarily for political prisoners. So that was the first concentration camp that's opened. On the 24th, Parliament met with all of the elected communist representatives absent. The National Socialists had a majority, and they passed the Enabling Act, which allowed Adolf Hitler, the chancellor, to rule by decree. Good luck. I want my percentage. Okay. Don't worry. Okay. So it's there when you can really talk about this is when Adolf Hitler and the National Socialists grabbed control of the government. April 1st, 1933, I just put it up there, this was when the economic boycott began. Don't buy from Jews. It was supposed to last 5 days. It lasted 1 day. It wasn't very successful. But this was the first attempt where there was going to be active attempts to restrict, from the government perspective, Jewish life, and from the party perspective. And all through April, different laws were decreed restricting Jewish presence, although they did not use the word Jew in the legislation. They used the word non-Aryan. And a non-Aryan was anyone who had one or more non-Aryan grandparents. However, there were restrictions or exceptions. That is, individuals who had fought on the front, who had received an Iron Cross of any degree, if they were in the civil service, they could remain. If they were doctors who used the National Health Service, they could still use it. If they were teaching at a university, they could still teach. Also, if you had been a member of the civil service or at the university or a physician before World War I started, you could stay. That's in 1933. Why? Because the population wanted to restrict what they perceived as the excessive influence and presence of the Jews. They were, what percentage of the German population do you think was Jewish? What? 1%. And yet, and so the fact that you would have in Berlin, for instance, 40% of the physicians were Jewish. That was Berlin. It was the capital, and as the capital is the most visible, so people wanted to remove excess Jewish presence, not to remove the Jews. So in 1933 is about removing excess Jewish presence, not removing the Jews. In 1935, there were no longer these exceptions for veterans or for individuals who had been in the civil service since before the Great War. On July 14th, 1933, several key things happened that would have important implications. One, all parties were declared illegal. So this became the one-party state. The only party that existed was the National Socialist Party. Two, individuals from Eastern Europe who had come to Germany after World War I and had become citizens, it was ruled that they could be automatically deported, removed, expelled, if the government so chose. So, in other words, at this point, for the first time, citizens could be expelled from Germany. And these individuals from Eastern Europe were primarily Jews. Also, on July 14th, 1933, the first laws about compulsory sterilization were passed. So these eugenics laws. Now, they weren't based on race, but they were based on a notion of congenital diseases. So the relationship between the inherited defects and inherited race very easily can overlap. But it's not on racial terms. Okay? Now, at this point, Adolf Hitler is chancellor. He's the Führer, the leader of the Nazi party, but he is the chancellor of the German state. On August 2nd, 1934, Hindenburg dies. Hitler becomes president. He becomes then Führer of party and state. So that's August 2nd, 1934. Questions? Yes?
What was the perception of Hitler? I don't know how the Germans got 36 of them.
Okay. 1934. Have you ever seen or heard of the film Triumph of the Will? Okay, Triumph of the Will is this documentary about the September 1934 Party Congress. Okay, which presents Hitler as Germany, Germany as Hitler. And you have just massive crowds in Nuremberg, because it was a party conference, beginning to shape public sentiment. You have the Ministry of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment, Goebbels, broadcasting constantly. So they're beginning to shape a German population for whom Hitler is the leader, the Führer, all to whom one looks toward, whom everyone depends on. So it's developing at this point. And in 1935, September 15th, the Nuremberg Laws are announced, which defines citizenship or state residence, being a inhabitant, a resident of the state, a member of the state, but not a citizen. And these rules applied not to non-Aryans, but to Jews. And a Jew, a full Jew, was defined as anyone who had 3 or more Jewish grandparents.
My question is really, where was the red flag that the world, in this case United States and United Kingdom, should have said, that's the problem? Up to this point, it's invisible. It's invisible.
At this point, Germany was still seemingly following the various sanctions and limitations declared by the Treaty of Versailles, which I forgot to mention, I'm sorry, in 1919, which was also, which led to great reparation responsibilities, which helped feed the inflation, which broke up German territory. So there was now this corridor, a Polish corridor, which separated West Prussia from East Prussia. They were not permitted to create an air force. There were limitations on the size of the Navy, of the Army. All of these limitations were there. And so at this point, the view was Germany was defanged. Also, every other nation was concerned about their own problems with the effects of the Depression on them.
There was also a perception, both in this country and in Britain, that the Nazis would be a counterforce against the Bolsheviks.
Yes.
And John Kennedy's father, for example, was a principal advocate of that.
Oh, no. In other words, the Nazis were viewed, there was a great fear about, after the Russian Revolution, the communists, and what Adolf Hitler had done and what the Nazi Party had done in Germany was they had squashed the communists in Germany. And therefore they would provide a bulwark against the Russians. And so there was a support for them. In other words, they would justify it as the lesser of two evils. Although for some it was not a lesser evil. It was a unacknowledged good. Okay, but yes, thank you, Lynn. So these rules declare that these full Jews were no longer citizens of Germany. Therefore, therefore the rights and privileges of citizenship were denied them. If you had two Jewish grandparents, you were a Mischling, often translated as bastard, a half-Jew first degree. There's no such thing as a half-German. There's only a half-Jew. And there were, but the restrictions, the restrictions were not applied to them. And then there were those who had one Jewish grandparent who were of second degree. And so again, there were limitations on them, but it was not, they were not subjected to the same experiences that so-called full Jews were.
Were Jews still allowed out of Germany at this point?
They were allowed out of Germany, but they were not allowed into virtually any place else. And so you had, beginning with 1933, you both had Jews as well as people of the left fleeing Germany. And it was there when you began having a notion of refugee emerging, but there was no international organization. And again, with the Depression, I mean, in 1924, America had, closed the door. And these other countries had closed the door.
The white paper, too.
What? Yes.
The white paper.
And the British had closed the door on Palestine as a place where Jews could go.
Yeah, do you think really up to that point that the whole concept of hate really was not a lawful principle? You mentioned the genocide of Armenians. You have Woodrow Wilson, who was a Jim Crow champion. We had our issues here in the United States of America. Hate here. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me up to that point, when my original question was, where was the red flag of Hitler? We can see it in retrospect, but hate was not
The notion that,
a full principle.
no, I mean, Americans provided models. Already in the 1880s, with the Chinese Exclusion Acts, became the models for for the political anti-Semitic movement. The legislation that they attempted to get enacted, but was never enacted, to exclude Eastern European Jews from coming to Germany was based on what the U.S. had done with the Chinese. I know, but what I want to talk about are, you had society.
Nothing stopped.
You had.
Up to that point, because hate was kind of almost an accepted,
Well-
not accepted, but we had hate here with Native Americans, Black Americans.
No, you had
Same thing with UK.
No, in the UK you had the Irish.
Yeah.
No, in various different societies you had a dominant group, and you had other groups who were less likely. Sometimes these were tacit, implicit, de facto restrictions. In others, it was de jure limitations. So there was no notion that every individual is a human being or a citizen. You had it on the laws, but in the way it was in practice was something else. Okay. Now, another one of the laws that were passed, announced with the Nuremberg laws, was there could no longer be any marriage between a Jew and a German. There could no longer be any sexual intimacy between a Jew and a German. And there could no longer be any woman between the age of 15 and 45, that is, of childbearing age. No German woman of childbearing age could work in a Jewish household, so that they would be protected from the seduction and racial contamination of the head of household. So these were the Nuremberg laws. They also were not allowed to fly the flag. Okay.
Was there, from a Jewish perspective, prior to that time, was there an acceptance of intermarriage between Jews and non-Jews?
Well, for quite a while, states did not allow it. So until after World War I, marriages were performed by either rabbis or in churches, and a Jew could not marry a Catholic or a Protestant unless either they converted or changed their registration to being without confession. So there were restrictions in those terms.
But
Okay.
there weren't the same restrictions on Catholics and other religions?
Well, there you would again have, it depended upon, you still have certain kinds of implicit desired restrictions. But the major concern was, and again, if a Catholic church permitted an intermarriage, then it would be permitted. But the Jews were specifically restricted until later on. Okay. September 30th, 1938. Okay. So at this point, full Jews are not citizens. During this period, there are increasing restrictions on Jewish life in Germany. People to be Jewish and engage in business was not a good thing, because there were increasing restrictions about Jewish businesses were not able to provide goods for the state. They could not provide goods for the party. And eventually it was a very bad business climate for industries who before had had Jewish management to maintain Jewish managers. But again, where else can they go? So they would go to France, they'd go to the Netherlands, and they would be stateless. Because by 1938, at the instigation of Switzerland and Sweden, if you had a passport and you were Jewish, you had a big J stamped on it so that everybody would know that you were Jewish. And if you happened to have a name, as I mentioned before, that wasn't obviously Jewish, and you were a man, you had to adopt a middle name of Israel, and if you were a woman, you had to adopt the middle name of Sarah, so that the name on your big J passport indicated that you were Jewish. But in September 30th, 1938, Germany expelled tens of thousands of these Poles who had come to Germany after World War I, Polish Jews, and expelled them to Poland. But Poland didn't want them. So in the no man's land between Germany and Poland, you had, in the beginning of winter, tens of thousands of Polish Jews, including the parents of a young Jewish boy in Paris by the name of Herschel Greenspan, who on November 6th assassinated the fourth consul. In other words, you have ambassador second, very low consular authority, and consequently, as a consequence of this attack by the Jews on the German state and on the German people, the German people spontaneously rose up on the night of November 9th, November 10th for Kristallnacht, the November pogrom. Synagogues throughout Germany, which at this point now also included Austria, which had been annexed, were set on fire unless they abutted on non-Jewish property, and so often they would just merely be vandalized rather than set on fire out of fear of destroying the adjacent property. And on occasion, there were indeed a few officials who stood in front of synagogues and stopped this, but these were by very far a very rare occasion. Tens of thousands of Jewish businesses were vandalized. Their windows crashed. That's why Kristallnacht, because of the broken glass in all the streets. Yes? Yes. October 28th is when these individuals who had been citizens in Germany, but who had now become mere residents of Germany, were kicked out, expelled from Germany to Poland, but Poland wouldn't take them in. No, it's October 28th. Oh, you're right. Sorry. September 30th is Munich. Munich. Sorry. Okay, this is when Chamberlain met with Hitler and Peace in Our Time, and they gave the Sudetenland to Germany. These were the German-speaking areas of Bohemia and Moravia. Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Please correct your sheets. I'm so sorry. Okay. Oh yeah, and besides, we're over here. Kept on looking over there. I was wondering where the dates went. Okay. Okay. So now, 91 Jews were killed that night. But the key event were 30,000 Jews as Jews, not as communists, not as social democrats, not as criminals, but as Jews were put in preventive detention in concentration camps. So this was the first time Jews, for being Jews, were being placed in concentration camps. And the vast majority of those who survived that, their stays from 2 to 4 months, would get out. But if they did not manage to emigrate from Germany at that point, eventually they would be returning. But this was preventive detention. And Kristallnacht was the one public German attack on Jews that remained in the consciousness of the German people during the rest of the Third Reich. And when, yes?
Was that the Night of the Long Knives?
Night of the Long Knives was different. That was back in 1934, and that was killing Rome, who was head of the stormtroopers. Okay? Okay. September 1st, 1939 is the invasion of Poland, the beginning of World War II. A portion of Poland becomes a protectorate. This were Łódź, were Lodges. The major part was called the General Government. Krakow, Warsaw, Lublin. It's here. Whereas for the Jews in Germany, between 1933 to 1939, there was this incremental increase in restriction of Jewish life. A community that was assumed to be the most assimilated became increasingly dissimilated. There was not an attempt at physical death, but there was a growing social death of Jewish life in Germany. When they came to Poland, it was almost immediate. It took over 5 years before Germans confiscated Jewish property involuntarily. It wasn't until after Kristallnacht that there was involuntary confiscation of Jewish property. In the first months of 1939 in Poland, Jewish property was confiscated. Jews in Poland had to wear stars to identify themselves. This would not occur in Germany until 1941 in September, and would not occur in the Western countries like the Netherlands or France until the spring of 1942, but it was immediate in Poland. And in October of 1939 was the attempt to expel all German Jews into Poland. They were going to engage in what they were referred to as we would think of it as the ethnic cleansing of Germany, rendering Germany Judenrein by moving all of the Jews at this point, including Austria and Czechoslovakia, close to 500,000 Jews, into Poland. But this plan collapsed for a variety of reasons, including the refusal of the General Governor of Poland, Hans Frank. He didn't want them either. But here's the beginning in October of the attempt to remove, not just restrict Jewish life, not try to motivate them to emigrate, but no one would accept them, but to literally expel them.
What good would it have done to expel them to Poland because of the idea of establishing living space for Jews, for the German people?
Well, see, you create little contradictions, the little problems, which will then lead to other kinds of solutions. So this was a step to remove them from Germany. But again, as you were saying, it creates other problems.
So the president of Poland labeled the Jews with the star?
At this point, there is no president of Poland. They're in exile because they had been conquered by Germany. By the end of September, there is no Polish government in Poland. They're in London. And 1/3 of Poland is now under Soviet control because of the agreement. So 1/3 so Eastern Poland was under Soviet control. So Lvov and other places. And I'd put October 15th here because that is when Adolf Hitler signed the euthanasia decree, creating a series of administrative units to euthanize both young children born with various defects and adults, primarily adults in mental asylums. When in the summer of 1941, when it was officially stopped, this program, this euthanasia program called T4, when it was officially stopped, it continued, but it was officially stopped. What developed out of this were new technicians of death, because as part of the euthanasia program, these very inventive individuals created the fake shower room, because it was much more efficient to kill large numbers of the mentally ill at one blow in gas chambers than through shots of phenol or air into the lung, into the heart. So the euthanasia program helps develop this technology that would be used for the destruction of European Jewry. The 22nd of June, 1941, is when Germany invades the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. And the huge Jewish population, both in eastern Poland, in the Ukraine, in Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia. It was characterized by the Germans as a war of extermination against Judeo-Bolshevism. And they went there and they had what was called the Commissar Decree, which is that they would not follow the Geneva Convention whenever they encountered political officers which were attached to every unit. And it would then be extended to partisans, or those who may be considered as opposition, which very quickly included all male Jews. And the Commissar Decree would allow not the imprisonment, but the summary execution of the commissars. The non-commissars among the Soviet prisoners of war were not that much better insofar as several million were starved to death by the Germans at this time. And now, the last two events. Because on the 8th of December, 1941, Chelmno opened. Chelmno was the first death camp. Its purpose was simple: just to kill all the Jews in Wartheland, this portion of Poland that was becoming a protectorate of Germany. And Chelmno, this little town, Jews in the area, and within a month also Roma and Sinti, gypsies, would be included in this, would be brought to this castle and then taken to gas trucks. And as the gas truck would drive for 30 minutes or so, they would be suffocated. So this is December 8th. In other words, before the Wannsee Conference, January 20th, 1942, when Heydrich held a conference that was initially scheduled back in early December, but because of Pearl Harbor had to be delayed. But what happened in this conference was to get various party, government, economic organizations to accept Heydrich's leadership in the final solution. But what we are seeing here is that before the final solution conference occurred, the final solution was already underway.
So this conference was held where?
In Wannsee, which is a suburb of Berlin, lovely, wealthy suburb, lovely home. Confiscated Jewish property. No, we're done. We're done. We're done. Because next week, what we'll deal with is, when did it end? And also talk about numbers. Okay? Anyway, thank you so much for listening. I very much appreciate your patience, and I'm here if you have additional questions. What? Chemno? C-H-E-L-N.